For today's video, I'll be going over aquarium water changes to clear up some common myths and misconceptions in the hobby. This video is primarily for people who use tap water in their tanks like myself, as many of the issues I'll be discussing can be avoided by switching over to reverse osmosis water and remineralizing it. But before we get into any specifics, I do want to quickly share my personal stance on water changes. I'm not against water changes by any means, but I prefer to only do water changes in my tanks when there's a clear identifiable reason, as there are some potential downsides of doing excess water changes in your tank that are commonly overlooked. So let's start with one of the most common reasons people do water changes, and that is to remove the excess nitrate buildup in the tank. In a typical cycled aquarium, fish waste breaks down and releases ammonia, which beneficial bacteria then convert into nitrite and finally into nitrate. Over time, these nitrates can build up, contributing to algae growth, and if they get high enough, they can end up being harmful to your fish. There are ways to manage nitrate levels in your tank without water changes, such as keeping fast-growing plants or cultivating specialist microorganisms in your tank, but in many cases, the simplest and most straightforward option is a water change. Where I live in northeast England, this method works completely fine. But there is a catch, because the World Health Organization recommends a maximum nitrate concentration of 50 ppm in drinking water, and countries including the UK use this guideline as their legal limit. This is a map of the UK showing the average nitrate levels in tap water, and as you can see, areas around London often have levels at or above 35 ppm. So, depending on where you live, doing a water change to reduce nitrates could actually end up increasing them, and if you're specifically trying to counter something like an algae bloom in your tank, you could just be providing them with additional food to grow. I leave a link to the source for the map in the description for people in England, because all of the counties are listed with the nitrate levels in our tap water. Another common reason hobbyists do regular water changes is the belief that over time minerals will accumulate in the tank, increasing the total dissolved solids or TDS to harmful levels, especially if you're only topping up evaporated water rather than doing water changes. And to be fair, that is a valid concern in a lot of setups, and there's no way around that. But if you're running a planted aquarium with the right fast-growing plants, you can largely avoid this issue with relative ease. Thankfully, these plants don't just help TDS levels either, they can also make it far easier to manage nitrate buildup while also helping to stabilise some other key water parameters. For instance, I have a planted tank that's been running for over a year with barely any water changes, just the occasional top off to counter evaporation. Yet, the TDS for this tank hovers around 250 thanks to the Rotala rotundifolia and duckweed doing a lot of heavy lifting. I also have another tank that's over a year old, and the pearlweed in here is thriving so well that the TDS actually hovers at around 160, which is below the recommended TDS for the Neocaridina shrimp in here. Because the plants are using so many minerals out of the water as nutrient sources to support their growth rate, I'm actually considering using a shrimp salt product to increase the mineral content in this tank so my shrimp can mold healthily. So TDS can become a problem in tanks without plants, but if you're on the planted tank side of the hobby, you're in a far better position to manage this and reduce your water change frequency. And this concept isn't just aquarium specific either, it's part of a broader field called phytoremediation, where plants are used to clean up contaminated soil, water and sediments. It's a very well-researched and well-funded area, with plenty of free studies available on platforms like ResearchGate and Science Direct if you want to check some of them out yourself. This is a table that I put together with the data from one of these research papers. It shows the aggregate absorption rates of various TDS contributing elements in an aquarium by Lemna minor, which is commonly known as duckweed. As you can see, the absorption rates are very impressive and high across the board, and without those plants in there, they would have just been stagnating in the water and building up. In fact, according to Cognitive Market Research, the global phytoremediation market was actually valued at $6.2 billion in 2023, which is over 3 times the value of the aquarium hobby in total. Thankfully, there are plenty of easy variants of species like Rotala, Hygrophila, pearlweed, Limnophila, Ludwigia, Vallisneria, water lettuce, duckweed, salvinia, Amazon frogbit and plenty of others that can all help manage the TDS in our aquariums if you are on the planted tank side of the hobby. Another reason I've seen people do regular water changes in their aquariums is to replenish essential minerals. I do think that this idea traces back to the Wallstad method, where Diana Wallstad has a section on using minerals present in tap water to support plant growth. Now, while this is technically true, it is important to keep everything in perspective because it's not the only thing adding minerals to the tank. For example, the mineral content in the tap water from her examples in her book are nowhere near what's in the actual soil used in that method. It's not even comparable. She also has a section on feeding a decent fish food to the livestock in the tank, and this outperforms the minerals in tap water for almost everything other than magnesium. But even then, the actual amount of magnesium you get in your tap water will heavily depend on the mineral content of your local water supply. And then on top of that, like I mentioned, the magnesium supply in soil is far higher than that of in water. So while in some setups water changes can top up a few minerals, the actual benefit is usually pretty minimal. Feeding your livestock a good quality diet, even in moderate amounts, will generally provide far more value when it comes to replenishing essential minerals in both your livestock and your plants. Another common reason people do water changes is to improve their water clarity, whether it's due to a buildup of particulate matter or the release of tannins from driftwood and substrate. Personally, I prefer to deal with particulate matter using mechanical filtration, but I have done a few water changes to clear up tannins. A light yellow or brown tint really doesn't bother me on my aquarium water, but it can get bad as certain driftwoods start to release more and more tannins into the water, and that's where I draw the line and do a water change. I know there's products like Purigen on the market that can remove tannins when they are added to your filter, but even though I've used Purigen successfully a couple of times, I still don't really know what it's made of, so personally I would lean more towards a water change for this specific reason. But opting for low tannin release driftwoods and substrates can reduce the need for this in your aquarium. The next point that I want to cover is more about confirmation bias than an actual reason to do water changes. It's the idea that fish become more active in their tank directly after a water change, and that this increased activity means that the fish are happy with their new water in the tank. Personally, I don't think that the new water is what's causing this behaviour in any way, shape or form, and this is actually very easy for you to test in your own aquarium. The next time you do a water change in your tank, simply watch how your fish behave as the water levels decrease in the tank. In my experience in my own aquariums, the spike in activity usually begins as soon as the fish notice a sudden drop in water volume before any of the new water is even in the tank. To me, this suggests that the behaviour is likely a stress response and not excitement or happiness due to a water change. On top of that, changes in water temperature between the tank water and the replacement water can also induce temperature shock and further stress the fish. I know I briefly touched on this one earlier, but another reason people commonly do water changes is to try and counter algae growth. The idea is that they are removing nutrient-rich water which is feeding the algae from your tank, and then they'll replace it with tap water that, in theory at least, contains fewer nutrients and try and starve the algae out. The problem is, the two main nutrients that contribute to algae blooms in an aquarium are nitrates and phosphates. And, as I mentioned earlier, depending on where you live, your tap water could already contain high levels of nitrate. As a recap, here's that map from earlier, and depending on where you live in the UK, you could be taking water out of your tap that has around 30 ppm of nitrate in it, but I did have people saying that in their area it's as high as 50 ppm. So if you are trying to combat algae caused by high nitrate levels in your aquarium, a water change may actually end up making the situation worse by adding more nitrate, not less. And for context, my aquariums typically range between 5 and 20 ppm of nitrate at any given time depending on the specific tank. So if I did live in Greater London, where tap water nitrate levels are considerably higher than here in the northeast, I could easily be increasing the nitrate level in my aquariums. Then we get to phosphates, which are a little different. While phosphates are intentionally added to drinking water here in the UK, it's usually at around 1 ppm and it's specifically to help manage lead levels in the plumbing. So due to this, a lot of that ends up becoming the lead phosphate compound, and it's not known how much of it actually ends up getting into our tanks during water changes. But the problem is that depending on your setup, phosphates can end up building up constantly in your tank, although it may be at a slow pace. A good example of this is my 40-gallon tank, and I've noticed a direct correlation between rising phosphate levels and algae blooms in this specific aquarium, but it doesn't happen in any of my other tanks. What's worked for me is doing a deep clean on the filter once every month, as well as a 50% water change, and this routine has managed to prevent the phosphate buildup and keep the algae at bay. But again, I live in the northeast where we really don't have much nitrate in our tap water, so I'm not spiking that. So yeah, depending on your local water supply, water changes might increase your nitrate levels, but they might also help reduce phosphate levels. It's all about doing some research and trying to work out what's in your tap water. Another common reason that people on the planted tank side of the hobby do water changes is to help their red plants develop a deeper, more vibrant colour. While strong lighting is essential, the other key factor is to try and reduce nitrate levels in the tank to very low or even undetectable levels to stress the plant and create that red colour. I'm actually planning on testing this in 2 new tanks that I'm going to build soon, and my plan is to do water changes to try and minimise the nitrate in the tank to try and keep red plants as deep and beautiful as possible. But, as I mentioned earlier, I'm in the northeast of England where we have barely any nitrate in our tap water, and if I was down in Greater London, this strategy would be almost impossible. I do think this is why a lot more aquascapers are using reverse osmosis water and then remineralising it to meet their desired parameters. It just gives them more control over what's happening in their tank and makes things like red plants a lot easier to achieve. Another common reason why people do water changes is to maintain a stable pH and prevent their tank from gradually becoming more acidic over time. This slow drop in pH is often caused by the nitrification process, where the beneficial bacteria in the aquarium filter convert ammonia into nitrite and then finally into nitrate, while releasing hydrogen ions into the water in the process, which lowers pH. In some setups, this gradual acidification of the water is unavoidable without doing water changes, so that is definitely a valid reason to do regular water changes if your pH drops too much. It's also worth noting that the more fish you keep in your tank and the more food that you feed them, the faster that this process will happen. In fact, in this type of aquarium, the biggest consumer of dissolved oxygen might not even be your actual fish. It could be the beneficial microorganism colonies in your filter that maintain the water parameters. Ammonia oxidizing bacteria and nitrite oxidizing bacteria require a surprisingly large amount of oxygen to function properly and can drastically increase the biological oxygen demand on your aquarium. And another thing to point out is that as oxygen is consumed and replaced by carbon dioxide through the respiration of either your fish or these microorganism colonies, the water can also start to acidify from this too. But this is where live plants can actually help, and the phrase moderation is key definitely applies to this one. By moderately planting your tank, moderately stocking your tank, and moderately feeding your tank, you can strike a balance that supports stable pH levels without needing a lot of water changes. This is because the plants can start to take on a significant portion of the filtration load in the tank, reducing the size of the beneficial microorganism population required to support your water parameters and keep everything safe and stable. In turn, this lowers the biological oxygen demand in the tank and leaves more oxygen available in the water. Since many aquatic plants prefer to absorb ammonium as their nitrogen source, which is right at the start of the nitrification process, rather than nitrate, which is at the end, they can help significantly reduce the number of hydrogen ions released during nitrification too, which would otherwise lower pH. Additionally, during the day, plants absorb CO2 from the water column and produce oxygen via photosynthesis, which helps buffer against pH swings and counters the acidification of the tank. While it is true that photosynthesis stops when the lights turn off and that the plants will respire at night, releasing CO2, this usually isn't a problem if you've balanced your tanks and not overstocked it. As I mentioned earlier, in some setups, beneficial microorganisms may be the largest consumers of dissolved oxygen, working 24/7 to keep your water parameters in check. By relying more on plants which have a far lower oxygen demand across a full 24-hour cycle, your tank can remain in a net positive state when it comes to dissolved oxygen, especially when stocking and feeding are done in moderation. And beyond that, there's also ways plants help to reduce the chemical oxygen demand in our aquariums too, but that really is a topic for another video. So in short, when you keep suitably planted aquariums, the acidification process, which often occurs in non-planted setups and typically requires water changes to manage, can be significantly slowed down or even stopped completely with plants. Another reason people often do water changes is to reduce the buildup of lipids, proteins and sugars in their aquariums. These organic compounds contribute to your tank's true TDS, but they are often invisible on a standard TDS meter because they don't conduct electricity, so unless you have expensive lab equipment, they often go undetected. Like many other reasons for water changes in the aquarium hobby, this one definitely has its place, especially in non-dirted tanks or setups where you're not using any kind of waste-eating bacteria. This is because soil naturally contains a wide range of beneficial bacteria colonies that can help break down organic waste and prevent this from being a problem. And if you're not using capped dirt, products like API Stress-Zyme, Fritzyme 360 or anything that's marketed towards getting rid of gunk in your filter can help get these bacteria strains into your tank. Specifically, strains from the Bacillus and Pseudomonas genus of bacteria have shown the ability to produce the digestive enzymes such as protease, amylase and lipase, which break down proteins, sugars and fats. One standout species is Bacillus subtilis, which I know I've mentioned in some of my other videos, but this really is an unsung hero in the hobby. Bacillus subtilis is a non-pathogenic strain of bacteria, just like the nitrifying bacteria we use in our filter, meaning it's not associated with any harmful side effects in our fish, shrimp, snails or plants. On top of this, it also has a very short doubling time, meaning that it can reproduce quickly in our aquariums and can outcompete harmful bacteria strains for resources, helping to keep their populations under control so your fish's natural slime coats can defend against them. And the best part is, if you're already using a capped dirt substrate, there's a good chance that you already have these bacteria in your tank because they are in the soil. But even if you're not using a capped dirt substrate, they could still have naturally worked their way into the tank, and you can use waste-eating bacteria products like API Stress-Zyme or Fritzyme 360 to manually add them. If you're overfeeding and overstocking your tank, then the organic waste-eating bacteria can be overwhelmed by the waste that ends up building up, and you will still need to resort to water changes to manage it. Finally, I want to touch on the idea of doing water changes to reduce growth stunting pheromones in breeding and grow-out tanks. Before I go any further, I should mention that this isn't a major focus in the hobby for me. While I do enjoy breeding shrimp, mainly because it's relatively simple and the parents won't eat their young, I just haven't spent much time researching breeding fish. But like many reasons for water changes in our tanks, this one really does depend on your specific setup. And to be honest, this one is a bit of a tough topic to research thoroughly anyway, just because there's so much conflicting information out there, and there's a lot of heated debates on social media and Reddit about this. One argument I've seen floating around involves lanreotide, which some people point to as a reason why water changes are necessary in a fry tank. The claim is that Lanreotide has a half-life of up to 5 days depending on its release method, which is actually true, so the growth inhibiting pheromones in the tank won't break down on their own and need to be removed via water changes. But here's the issue, Lanreotide isn't actually what baby fish secrete. It's a synthetic version of somatostatin, which is a pheromone that fry naturally release. Lanreotide is actually engineered to use in humans to help treat tumours and other health conditions, and its extended half-life is deliberately designed to make it more effective at treating various health issues. The natural hormone somatostatin actually has a far shorter half-life, which is around 2 minutes long. That said, if you are keeping a high density of fry in a small tank, it's still possible for somatostatin to accumulate to levels where it may cause problems with growth stunting in the fish. In those situations, water changes could definitely help mitigate these effects, but there's a lot of variables at play on this one. Personally, I raised my Medaka fry in a 29-gallon grow-out tank and things have been going well so far. Since learning the differences between the synthetic Lanreotide and the natural somatostatin, I've actually stopped doing regular water changes in this tank and all the fry seem to be growing perfectly well without issue. Anyway guys, that brings the video to an end. I know that was a lot to cover, and as I mentioned throughout the video, water changes can be a valid and effective strategy. It all depends on your setups and goals. But on the flip side of that, there's often alternative approaches that you can take to reduce the frequency of the water changes you need in your aquarium. I hope this video has been helpful, thanks for watching and good luck with your aquariums.